Hello and welcome. Tonight, we're going to drift far, far back in time to a year that historians, scientists, and chroniclers agree was unlike almost any other in recorded human memory. But before we begin, I'd like to ask you to take a moment to support the channel. If you enjoy stories that carry you through the forgotten corridors of history, strange worlds, and the mysteries of the past, please give this video a like. It truly helps more than you can imagine. And don't forget to subscribe so you never miss our next journey into the past. Now, I have a question for you. Where in the world are you listening from tonight? Are you in a quiet city apartment where the distant hum of traffic becomes part of the night's lullaby? Or in a countryside home where the only sound is the rustle of leaves beyond the window? Let me know in the comments. I'm always fascinated by where these stories find their way. And now, let's step into the mists of the 6th century, into a year shrouded in ash, fear, and a strange, almost dreamlike gloom. The year was 536 AD, though those who lived through it had no idea they were part of a moment that future generations would call the worst year to be alive. To them, it was not a number on a calendar, it was simply the year when the sun forgot how to shine. Across much of the known world, from the Byzantine Empire to the far edges of China, from Ireland's rugged shores to the heart of the Arabian deserts, the sky took on a strange and unsettling pallor. Chroniclers of the time describe it as a dim veil, a pale shadow cast across the heavens, as if the light of day had been drained away. It was not night, yet it was not day. The sun rose, but it was a weak, washed-out orb, struggling to push through something vast and unseen. For 18 long months, this dimness persisted. Crops withered in the fields, unable to find the strength to grow. Seasons blurred summer felt like a half-forgotten spring, and winter crept in with an early, biting cruelty. And it wasn't only the dim light, the air itself changed. A fine, almost imperceptible dust settled over the land, clinging to clothing, to rooftops, to the surface of water in wells. People did not know what it was, but they felt it, breathed it, and feared it. Historians today believe it was the result of a massive volcanic eruption, or perhaps even a chain of them somewhere far to the north, spewing ash high into the stratosphere, spreading a haze across the entire northern hemisphere. Some point to Iceland, others to North America or Central America. The truth is still debated, but the effect was undeniable. It was not only the light that suffered, the temperatures fell dramatically. Rings in ancient trees, frozen in their annual growth patterns, show that this was one of the coldest decades in thousands of years. Farmers in Ireland recorded famine in their annals. In China, snow fell in the middle of summer. In the Byzantine world, bread became scarce, and hunger became an uninvited, persistent guest at every table. The psychological toll of such a world is difficult to imagine now. Imagine waking each morning to a sky that offers no warmth, to fields that offer no harvest, to a horizon that seems to retreat into shadow rather than open into day. For the deeply religious societies of the time, it could only mean one thing: that the end of days was near, that the heavens themselves had turned against humankind. Priests and monks led processions through streets, chanting prayers, carrying relics, asking for divine mercy. In the absence of explanation, people turned to prophecy, to superstition, to omens in the flight of birds and the strange shapes of clouds. Yet amid the fear, there were those who tried to adapt. Merchants sought food from regions less affected, though the prices rose so high that only the wealthiest could afford to eat well. Communities stored whatever grain they could, though in some places, the damp and cold caused it to spoil before winter's end. And then came the diseases. Weakened bodies, made frail by months of hunger, became easy prey for sickness. Though the Great Plague that would devastate the Byzantine Empire, the Justinian Plague, would come a few years later, smaller waves of illness swept through towns and villages, further thinning the ranks of the living. It is in such times that the human spirit is most starkly revealed. There are records of great kindness, neighbors sharing what little they had, strangers taken in and fed despite the risk. But there are also stories of cruelty, of theft, of violence over a sack of barley, of ships refusing to dock for fear of contagion. The strange half-light of 536 seemed to magnify both the best and the worst in people. And as the months dragged on, a strange thing happened to the rhythm of life. People began to measure time not in weeks or months, but in before the dimness and after the dimness. Children grew up in that shadowed world, knowing no other sky. When, at last, the haze began to lift slowly, almost reluctantly, the world they returned to was not the same as the one they had left. Fields needed replanting, herds had been thinned, and the memory of hunger lingered in every cautious glance at a nearly empty storehouse. Yet life, as it always does, found a way forward. By the early 540s, the sun once again shone with its full strength. But the people who walked under it carried the memory of its absence in their bones. It had been a lesson in fragility and in resilience, in the sheer unpredictability of the natural world. And it was a warning, too, that the earth itself could change the fate of empires, and that even the greatest cities were powerless against the will of the sky. When the dimness first settled over the earth, no one could have known that it would last for more than a season. In many places, there was initial curiosity rather than panic. People looked up at the pale, ghostly sun and spoke of it as if it were a passing omen, perhaps a sign of a coming royal birth or a shift in the heavens that would soon right itself. But as weeks turned into months, that curiosity turned to unease. Sailors in the Mediterranean reported that their voyages felt disoriented under the strange light, that the usual gleam of the water was dulled, and navigation by the sun had become less reliable. In the markets of Constantinople, vendors who relied on the warmth to ripen fruits found their baskets filled with hard, sour produce. Bread, a staple of every table, became more expensive with each passing month as the grain harvests dwindled. In the rural fields of Gaul, farmers watched the growth of their barley slow to a crawl. By midsummer, the stalks were thin and brittle, bending in the wind like grass in winter. In Scandinavia, hunters found that the animals they relied upon for meat were thinner than usual, their coats duller, their movements slower, a sign that even the wilds could not escape the creeping hunger. The North suffered worst of all. In Ireland, the annals record a failure of bread from the years 536 to 539, which is a chillingly simple phrase for such a devastating truth. Famine stalked the land for years, not months. The air itself felt different, damp and heavy, sometimes tinged with a faint metallic taste that people did not understand. And always, that fine dust. You could wipe a wooden table clean in the morning, and by evening, a thin layer would return. Monks recorded that it clung to their manuscripts, making the ink smear if they were not careful. In China, the official histories tell of frost in the middle of summer, of yellow dust falling from the sky like pollen, and of crop failures so severe that entire regions faced starvation. In the steppelands, nomadic tribes were forced to migrate in search of pasture for their animals, bringing them into conflict with neighboring clans. War, as always, fed upon scarcity. Armies marched not only for conquest, but for survival. For the Byzantines, who were locked in conflicts with the Ostrogoths and Persians, the shortages made every campaign more desperate. Soldiers who were promised regular rations found themselves shorted or paid in lesser coin. In villages, fathers went to war, knowing their families at home might not survive the winter. Across the empire, churches became places not only of worship, but of distribution, where whatever food could be gathered was shared among the faithful. Yet even in the great cities, people spoke in whispers about whether God's favor had turned. The dimness did not simply affect crops and trade. It seeped into the human mind. People woke feeling tired, as if the low light robbed them of energy before the day had even begun. Artists painted with darker palettes, poets wrote of shadows, and healers found more people complaining of melancholy, a deep sadness that had no obvious cure. Sleep patterns shifted. Without the full brightness of day, some people rose later, while others worked deep into what should have been night. The ancient rhythms of life were disrupted. Meanwhile, in distant parts of the world, the haze was noticed but interpreted differently. In the Arabian Peninsula, some poets described the light as a veil upon the bride of the day, while in the Andean highlands, though the dating is debated, there are signs of crop changes that might reflect the global cooling. The natural world itself seemed to bend beneath this strange event. Coral growth slowed, glaciers advanced, and in some regions, rainfall patterns shifted dramatically. Lakes froze earlier, rivers stayed icy longer. Entire ecosystems adjusted, but slowly, and not without casualties. For those living through it, the hardest part was not knowing if it would ever end. A year without a summer was unsettling enough. When the second summer came, and was no brighter, dread took root. There was no concept of climate science, no satellite to trace ash clouds, no means of understanding that they were caught in the ripple of a vast geological event. All they could do was endure. And endure they did, though, not without scars. In some places, oral traditions preserve stories of the dark years, warning future generations of a time when the sun hid and the earth grew cold. Archaeologists today find evidence of mass graves from this period, and in the layers of soil, traces of that very dust that once floated unseen in the air. Looking back, we know that the volcanic eruption or eruptions that began this chain of events likely happened somewhere between late 535 and early 536. Ice core samples from Greenland and Antarctica hold within them the frozen record of that disaster. Spikes of sulfur that testify to the massive volumes of material blasted into the sky. That material reflected sunlight away from the Earth, dropping temperatures and altering weather patterns in a way no human hand could have prevented. But the people of the 6th century did not need scientific proof to feel its weight. They saw it in their thin harvests, in the pale faces of hungry children, in the way the stars seemed sharper at night, as if the dimness of day had somehow made the darkness more complete. And while for us, it is a chapter in history, for them, it was life itself slowed, darkened, and shadowed by an uncertainty that reached into every corner of their days. By the end of the second year, the dim sun had become the new normal, but that did not mean life was any easier. It was in this period that the true human cost began to show itself most clearly. Entire villages, especially in the northernmost parts of Europe and Asia, were abandoned. People took what little they could carry: tools, blankets, small stores of food, and left in search of brighter skies or warmer climates. These migrations were slow and desperate. Families moved on foot or in small carts, often shadowed by hunger and disease. Some never made it to their intended destinations. The road was not only a path to safety, but a place of danger, where bandits preyed upon the weak, and local lords sometimes drove away starving strangers to protect their own dwindling resources. In the marketplaces of major cities, a strange economy emerged. Spices, once a luxury, were hoarded because they could mask the taste of spoiled or poor-quality food. Salt prices soared, for preserving meat was suddenly more vital than ever. Fish became more valuable than grain in some coastal regions, for at least the sea still offered a dependable catch. Yet even the fish were fewer in certain areas, driven away by changing water temperatures and currents altered by the climate shift. In Constantinople, Emperor Justinian's court tried to maintain an image of stability. Public games, religious processions, and the repair of aqueducts all continued. But beneath this thin veneer of imperial order, the population was restless. Rumors swirled that the emperor's military campaigns were draining resources that should have been used to feed the hungry. In taverns and on street corners, people whispered about omens and curses. The church urged the faithful to pray for divine intervention, and many did, gathering in candlelit vigils that stretched through the night, their hymns rising into the heavy, dim air. In Britain, which was still reeling from the collapse of Roman rule a century earlier, the effects were even harsher. Without a strong central authority, smaller kingdoms struggled to coordinate relief. Chroniclers write of black bread, made from whatever could be ground into flower roots, acorns, sometimes even moss. It was bitter and barely edible, but it kept people alive. Those with livestock often fared better, but fodder was scarce, and many were forced to slaughter animals earlier than usual, selling the meat quickly before it spoiled. The scent of smoke from these hurried feasts mingled with the constant dust in the air. In the east, Persia felt the dimming in its own way. The great cities along the Silk Road saw reduced trade as caravans became less frequent, and many routes grew dangerous with desperate raiders. Silk and precious metals still passed through, but foodstuffs became the true treasure. This scarcity led to tension between allies, as trade agreements were renegotiated under threat of force. Diplomacy was sharpened into a weapon, and even the most established partnerships between cities and empires grew brittle. Meanwhile, in the villages and towns far from the centers of power, life contracted to its bare essentials. People spoke less of the future and more of the next meal. Weddings were quieter, births rarer, funerals more common. The air of festivity that marked certain seasons faded. Festivals were canceled or stripped down to minimal rituals. In some regions, traditional celebrations were replaced by communal fasts and processions of penance, as if humility could coax the sun to return. There were also strange and unsettling side effects. Farmers noticed that some crops, hardy cabbages, root vegetables, certain beans grew better in the cooler conditions, and they began to shift their planting accordingly. But these adjustments took time, and time was the one resource they did not have in abundance. Archaeological digs today show sudden changes in pollen patterns in soil from this era, confirming that entire agricultural systems were forced to adapt almost overnight. The social structure itself shifted under the weight of scarcity. Local leaders who could secure food either through trade or force rose in prominence, while others lost influence. This was an age when loyalty could be bought with a loaf of bread or a sack of grain. The bonds of kinship and community were tested, sometimes breaking entirely. In certain records from the far north, there are grim mentions of cannibalism, a taboo so strong that it was rarely written about, but powerful enough that its shadow lingers in oral traditions to this day. Yet through it all, life persisted. Not in the bright, confident way it had before, but stubbornly, with a quiet resilience. People learned to navigate the dim light, to work with the shorter growing seasons, to rely on preserved foods and barter. They learned to read the subtle shifts in the haze, to guess at weather patterns by the smell of the wind or the tone of the sky. And slowly, though no one could have guessed it then, the volcanic veil began to lift. The sun grew a little stronger, shadows a little sharper. The haze did not vanish overnight, it would linger for years, but there were moments when the world seemed to remember its old warmth. Still, the memory of those long, dim years never left the people who endured them. For generations, they would speak of it in hushed tones, as a warning and as a testament to survival. The year 536 and those that followed had carved themselves into human history, not only in the chronicles of kings and monks, but in the bones of the land, the lines on the faces of survivors, and the stories passed down by the fireside long after the dust had settled. When the volcanic haze of 536 first began to thin, it did not bring immediate relief. In fact, for many regions, the transition to clearer skies introduced its own set of challenges. After years of dim, muted sunlight, the soil was depleted in strange ways. Nutrients had been washed away by excessive rains in some areas, while in others, the ground had hardened under prolonged cold, resisting the plow. Farmers who had learned to work under constant cloud now faced unpredictable bursts of sunlight that scorched seedlings not used to such heat. The rhythms of the land were broken, and in that chaos, a new danger took root: disease. Across the Mediterranean world, reports began to spread of sudden, unexplained fevers. In the bustling city of Pelusium, in Egypt, what would later be called the Plague of Justinian first appeared around the year 541. Its arrival was as if the years of famine and climate disruption had primed humanity for disaster. Ships carried grain from Egypt to Constantinople, and with it, rats. The rats carried fleas, and the fleas carried Yersinia pestis, the same bacterium that would centuries later cause the Black Death. the plague moved with a speed that confounded the empire's physicians. Within a single year, it had reached the heart of the Byzantine Empire. Chroniclers like Procopius described scenes that were almost incomprehensible in scale: corpses stacked in city streets, mass graves dug in haste, the wails of mourners echoing through neighborhoods abandoned by the living. Constantinople, the jewel of the Mediterranean, became a place of silence broken only by the sound of cartwheels carrying the dead. Emperor Justinian himself fell ill, though he recovered, but the city's population was devastated. Some accounts claim that at the height of the outbreak, 5,000 to 10,000 people died each day in the capital alone. The pandemic rippled outward, following trade routes across the Mediterranean and into Persia, North Africa, and parts of Western Europe. In the countryside, where people had been spared the worst of urban crowding, the sickness still struck with frightening efficiency. Villages that had endured the hardships of 536 were now emptied entirely, their homes left to crumble into the earth. The psychological impact was enormous. For those who had survived hunger and cold, the plague felt like a divine verdict, proof that their struggles had not been enough, that more penance was demanded. In churches and temples, prayers turned into desperate bargains. Some communities carried out public processions barefoot, carrying relics and icons through the streets, in the hope of warding off the unseen threat. Others turned inward, closing their gates to strangers, forbidding travel, and sealing themselves away from the outside world. Trade suffered once again, not from the dimming sun this time, but from fear. Merchants were suspected of carrying more than just goods. Every caravan, every ship became a potential bringer of illness. In the ports of Italy, Sicily, and the Levant, crews were sometimes forced to wait offshore for days, even weeks, before being allowed to unload an early form of quarantine that was as much about superstition as it was about protection. In some places, entire ships were burned without their cargo ever touching the dock, the fear of contamination outweighing the value of any goods. The plague did not vanish quickly. Waves returned over the course of decades, each one taking more lives. The combination of hunger, economic collapse, and epidemic led to a shift in population that altered the political map of Europe and the Mediterranean. Armies could not be fielded in their former strength. Fields lay unused for lack of workers. Some lands returned to wilderness, forests reclaiming fields that had been farmed for centuries. Wolves and other animals became bolder, moving closer to towns, sensing that people were fewer and weaker. Yet even as the sickness raged, there were those who adapted. Small farming communities began to focus on survival rather than expansion. Families and neighbors pooled their resources, creating close-knit groups that could withstand both hunger and illness. These groups shared not only food and labor, but also knowledge: what plants could help reduce fever, which river bends were best for fishing when meat was scarce, how to store grain in ways that kept pests out. In remote mountain villages, far from the main roads, life went on almost untouched by the plague. These places would later become refuges for those fleeing, bringing new people and traditions into old settlements. But the marks of those years, from 536's dim skies to the relentless spread of the plague, became part of cultural memory. Folktales told of years without sun, of the black wind that brought sickness, of the years when the earth seemed to reject its own children. These stories, passed from parent to child, became the fabric of medieval belief, shaping how people viewed eclipses, comets, and sudden weather changes for centuries to come. The year 536 had been the beginning, but its legacy stretched across generations, influencing the way medieval societies understood fate, fortune, and survival. By the middle of the 6th century, the combined weight of climate disaster and plague had reshaped the balance of power across the known world. Empires that had once seemed unshakable now found themselves weakened, not by invading armies, but by the slow, invisible forces of hunger, illness, and economic decline. The Byzantine Empire, despite its wealth and influence, struggled to maintain its territories. Fields that once fed cities now lay in ruin, their soil either flooded by constant rain or cracked by sudden drought. Grain shipments from Egypt, once the empire's main source of food, became unreliable. Even when the harvest was good, the risk of disease spread through trade made transportation dangerous. This fragility was not limited to Byzantium. In the far north, in the lands of the Norse and the early Germanic tribes, the climate shift brought failed crops that forced migrations. Communities that had farmed the same valleys for generations abandoned them, seeking new lands with more reliable seasons. Some moved south into Roman and post-Roman regions, pressing into areas already unsettled by earlier migrations. These pressures created friction. Local leaders, already struggling to feed their own people, saw outsiders as a threat. Tensions flared not only between different groups but also within them. Peasants, desperate and hungry, sometimes rose against their own rulers, accusing them of hoarding supplies or angering the divine. In some areas, famine fueled trials of those suspected of bringing harm through unnatural means. Centuries before they would become common in Europe. Individuals, often women, midwives, or healers, were accused of bringing the blight, of cursing the land, of summoning storms. Fear made logic irrelevant. In the courts of kings and chieftains, the mood shifted. Leaders who could once inspire confidence simply by displaying military strength now had to answer questions about divine favor. If their rule coincided with disaster after disaster, subjects began to wonder whether the gods had turned their faces away. In some cases, rulers sought to prove their piety by commissioning great works, churches, shrines, and processions meant to appeal to the heavens. In others, they turned to blood sacrifice, reviving pagan rituals that had long been outlawed, desperate for any sign of relief. Meanwhile, in the east, the Sasanian Persian Empire faced its own crises. The same climatic disruptions that battered Europe and the Mediterranean also swept through Mesopotamia and beyond. River systems like the Tigris and Euphrates became unpredictable, alternately flooding and drying, disrupting the delicate irrigation networks that sustained agriculture in the region. The plague found its way here too, crossing the trade routes that wound through desert and mountain passes. Entire military campaigns were delayed or abandoned, not because of enemy resistance, but because too many soldiers were sick to fight. Diplomacy shifted under these pressures. Former enemies sometimes agreed to temporary truces, recognizing that there was no profit in waging war while their populations starved and their armies withered. Yet even these truces were fragile. Resources were scarce, and when the immediate threat of famine eased in one region, the temptation to take from a weaker neighbor returned. For ordinary people, survival became a matter of improvisation. Diets changed drastically. In regions where wheat had failed, people ground acorns, chestnuts, or even dried moss into flour. In fishing communities, the reliance on preserved fish grew to unprecedented levels, with salted or smoked catches sustaining entire villages through months of failed harvests. Some turned to gathering wild plants and herbs that had once been dismissed as food for the poorest of the poor. The line between hunger and starvation was thin, and in some years, it vanished entirely. The psychological toll deepened. Children born during the darkness of 536 grew up in a world where scarcity was the norm, where the smell of sickness was familiar, and where the stories of a brighter, more bountiful past seemed almost mythical. These children became the adults who would carry forward a cautious, often fearful approach to life, hoarding when food was plentiful, mistrusting outsiders, and placing deep faith in omens, dreams, and signs. In this environment, religion and superstition were inseparable. A sudden eclipse could halt work in the fields, with people dropping to their knees in prayer, convinced it was a warning. A streaking comet might be taken as proof that another wave of plague or famine was imminent. Holy men, monks, and prophets found themselves with extraordinary influence, their words capable of calming or inciting entire communities. The idea that the world had entered a kind of cosmic trial, a testing of humanity's worthiness, spread across cultures, even those with no direct contact with each other. It was a time when isolation could mean safety, but it could also mean doom if a community miscalculated its stores or failed to secure enough labor to plant and harvest. Those who endured did so not through heroics, but through relentless, quiet adaptation. And in the background, the memory of the year 536 remained like a shadow stretching over the decades, a reminder that the sky could darken again at any moment, and that the foundations of life were far more fragile than anyone had dared to imagine. By the time the second decade after the year 536 arrived, much of the world had learned to live under a constant sense of unease, as if humanity itself had aged in a single generation. The skies had long since cleared, but the memory of that strange dimness, that cold, unnatural twilight that had blanketed summer and winter alike, never faded. It was spoken of in whispers, as though uttering its cause too loudly might summon it back. Those who had been children during the darkness were now adults, and their recollections were vivid. The way animals moved restlessly for months, as if sensing some great imbalance. The way the air had carried an acrid tang, not of smoke but of something older, earthier, as though the very soil was exhaling centuries of decay. The greatest chroniclers of the age, from the Mediterranean to China, left records of famines that lasted far longer than any ruler's patience, of towns abandoned not to enemy siege but to slow starvation. And yet, for all the devastation, there was no single villain to name, no invading army to rawl. Why against only the weather, the plague, and the quiet, merciless arithmetic of dwindling resources? In Byzantium, Emperor Justinian's grand ambitions to restore the Roman Empire's former glory had already been staggered by the onset of the plague. His armies, still among the finest in the world, were reduced to skeleton forces. Even victories felt hollow when they were followed by fresh outbreaks of disease in the very cities they had retaken. Trade routes that had once brought spices from India and silk from China now carried as much fear as they did profit, for every caravan might bear not goods alone, but infection. The economic shock was profound. Gold and silver grew scarce, not because the mines had failed, but because the web of commerce itself had frayed. Without trade, coins hoarded in vaults stayed there, and the marketplaces that had once bustled with merchants fell silent. In the countryside, barter replaced currency, and debts were forgiven not out of generosity but because they could never realistically be repaid. In the British Isles, still fragmented into rival kingdoms, the darkness and famine had their own peculiar effects. Archaeological evidence suggests that entire settlements shifted closer to rivers, marshlands, and coasts, places where fishing and gathering shellfish could supplement failing crops. Some hill forts, abandoned for centuries, were resettled as people sought defensible positions in case food shortages pushed neighbors into raiding. The oral histories of the Celtic and Anglo-Saxon peoples began to weave the events of the 530s and 540s into legend. Kings were said to have bargained with druids, saints, or even shadowy spirits for relief from the cold summers. Tales of ghostly armies marching through the fog may have been born from real war bands, desperate and wandering, whose movements seemed as sudden and inexplicable as storms. In the Islamic world, still decades from its explosive expansion, the lands of Arabia and its neighbors felt the edges of the Great Disruption. Caravan routes through the deserts experienced strange irregularities, sudden floods in places that had been dry for generations, then droughts that left oases barren. In some regions, tribes that had long relied on trade with the Byzantine and Sasanian worlds found themselves cut off, their goods unwanted or their paths too dangerous. Such isolation forced tighter internal bonds within tribes, but also sharpened rivalries over water, grazing land, and the shifting loyalty of allies. Across the oceans, far from the centers of empire, oral traditions among Native American peoples and Polynesian navigators tell of changes in the climate that match this period, shifts in prevailing winds, unseasonable rains, and disruptions to animal migrations. In the absence of written records, these were remembered as the works of gods, spirits, or ancestors displeased with the living. These interpretations, though rooted in faith, often carried practical consequences. new taboos on certain foods, seasonal prohibitions on travel, or rituals designed to restore balance. For the human mind, perhaps the greatest burden of 536 and the years that followed was not merely hunger or sickness, but uncertainty. It was one thing to endure a hard winter or a poor harvest. It was another to live without knowing whether the world would ever right itself. This uncertainty bred caution in some, recklessness in others. Entire villages might gamble their survival on a single expedition, sending every able-bodied hunter into the mountains for game, or committing all remaining seed to one desperate planting in untested soil. When these gambles failed, they left nothing behind but empty huts and the memory of those who had once filled them. And so, as the mid-6th century wore on, the earth itself began to heal. Fields slowly reclaimed their fertility. Herds grew in number, and trade resumed its cautious flow, but the people did not forget. The darkness had marked them. It had shown them that the order they built could be undone not by human ambition, but by forces too vast to predict or control. And in that lesson, passed from elders to the young, lay the seed of a new kind of vigilance, one that would echo down centuries, a knowledge that beneath the rhythms of life, there was always the chance that the sky might darken again, without warning, and that humanity's only true defense was to remember. When historians of later centuries looked back upon the mid-6th century, many saw it not simply as a crisis, but as a hinge in human history, a moment where countless paths closed forever and others, unforeseen, began to open. The year 536 was the spark, but what followed was an entire generation's struggle to adapt. By the early 540s, the survivors of that dark decade were living in a changed world, and the changes reached far deeper than the hunger that had haunted their days. In Constantinople, the Byzantine capital, the bustling avenues of marble and mosaic now carried a quieter tread. Justinian's great building projects, like the Hagia Sophia, had risen against the odds, but even their completion could not mask the sense that the empire had grown brittle. The plague that erupted in 541 was no random outbreak. Many believed it was seeded by the weakened bodies and impoverished diets of years past. Merchants who once carried silks and spices now feared touching the very goods they transported, knowing that somewhere along the chain of trade lay invisible death. Cities along the Mediterranean's edges, Alexandria, Antioch, Carthage, each had their moment of panic when ships in their harbors became floating prisons, quarantined by decree or by fearful mobs. Meanwhile, in the far north, the Norse world was undergoing transformations of its own. While Scandinavia's sagas would later cloak this age in myth, with frost giants and omens in the sky, archaeology tells us of longhouses abandoned, coastal settlements shrinking, and a greater reliance on the sea for survival. Fishing, sealing, and whaling became lifelines, and those who could build and crew sturdy ships found themselves in positions of power. In Iceland's later lore, echoes of this time survive as tales of sunless summers and the long hunger. The Sasanian Empire, Byzantium's great eastern rival, faced parallel struggles. The empire's heartlands in Mesopotamia had long been sustained by intricate irrigation systems, fed by the Tigris and Euphrates. Yet the strange climate patterns of the late 530s brought unpredictable floods, then periods of drought, which stressed even the most sophisticated waterworks. Farmers fled their parched or flooded lands, swelling the ranks of the urban poor. The Sasanian court, already engaged in near-constant tension with Justinian's armies, now found itself forced to divert resources to domestic relief, a strain that would have long-term consequences when Arab armies rose in the following century. Beyond the familiar maps of the ancient world, whole continents experienced their own upheavals. In Mesoamerica, certain Maya city-states show signs of sudden population decline during this era, perhaps due to failed harvests linked to the same global anomalies. In the Andes, Some highland communities expanded their terraces and irrigation in desperate attempts to coax life from the soil, while others abandoned centuries-old settlements to seek more stable climates. Polynesian voyagers, who navigated by stars, swells, and bird migrations, may have found their traditional cues disrupted, leading to voyages that stretched into uncharted waters. For those living through these years, there was no global narrative, no shared understanding that the entire world was under the same shadow. To a farmer in Gaul, the unseasonal frost was a local misfortune. To a fisherman in the South China Sea, the strange patterns of monsoons were a quirk of the gods. It would take modern science, piecing together ice cores from Greenland, volcanic ash layers, and tree ring patterns from across continents, to reveal that the crisis of 536 had been, in truth, planetary. Yet even without that knowledge, human beings everywhere adapted as best they could. In monasteries high in the Alps or tucked away in Irish valleys, monks labored over manuscripts, copying not only scripture but medical treatises, histories, and fragments of older worlds, preserving a memory of what had been. In market squares from Damascus to Toledo, traders improvised new routes, carrying whatever goods could be found in abundance, whether that meant salted fish instead of grain, wool instead of silk. In households large and small, the rituals of daily life were altered. The evening meal might be smaller, the bread coarser, the prayers longer. Parents taught their children the skills that had meant survival, how to recognize edible roots, how to repair tools, how to make do without luxuries. And beneath all of this was a deeper shift, harder to see but no less real. The quiet recognition that human life, for all its structures and empires, was at the mercy of forces far older and larger than itself. The great lesson of 536 was not only that darkness could come at any time, but that it would come without explanation, and perhaps without remedy. And so, as the first stirrings of recovery began in scattered pockets of the world, they were tempered by a caution that would live on in story, in custom, and in the guarded optimism of a people who knew just how fragile their light truly was. By the middle of the 540s, enough time had passed since the sunless summers that a new generation had been born, children who never remembered the way the light used to look. They had grown up thinking that the muted skies, the pale crops, and the short growing seasons were simply the way of the world. And yet, slowly, imperceptibly at first, the light began to return. It was not the blinding gold of earlier decades, but a clearer, warmer glow that brought with it a strange mixture of relief and fear. Relief, because people could work their fields without the same gnawing uncertainty about whether the plants would survive. Fear, because no one knew whether this was a true recovery or merely a reprieve before the next calamity. In Constantinople, the imperial court tried to reclaim a sense of normalcy. Justinian, ever ambitious, renewed his plans for military expansion, commissioning campaigns into Italy to reclaim lost Roman territories. But the empire's coffers were not as full as before, and its people were still weary. Tax collectors met with stiffer resistance. Farmers pleaded for more time to pay. In the countryside, small chapels dedicated to saints of mercy began to appear, funded not by the emperor but by local landowners seeking divine protection against another season of failure. Across the Mediterranean, in North Africa, the grain fields of the former Roman breadbasket were regaining some productivity, but the old abundance was gone. Ships still carried wheat to Europe, but now it was precious cargo, guarded and accounted for at every port. In Gaul, monasteries took on a new role as granaries and safe havens, their stone walls protecting not only relics and books, but sacks of grain. In Scandinavia, the long winters remained a trial, but the people had learned to meet them with fierce preparation. Communities pooled resources, storing dried fish, salted meats, and mead brewed from last summer's honey. Oral tradition, the sagas and skaldic poems began to weave the memory of the great darkness into their mythology. In these stories, the long, dim years became a test from the gods, a proving ground for the strongest clans. Elsewhere, in the heart of the Sasanian Empire, the king's advisors debated whether to continue costly wars or focus entirely on rebuilding the land. Canals needed clearing, farmland needed reseeding, and displaced families needed to be coaxed back to their villages. Those who had fled to the cities were reluctant to return, fearing the soil was cursed. In India, trade networks that once linked the subcontinent to the West and the Far East had shifted. New partners were found, old roots abandoned. Local dynasties rose or fell depending on how well they adapted to the changes in climate and commerce. Meanwhile, far to the east, in China, court records from the Northern Wei and Liang dynasties spoke of droughts, floods, and locust swarms in close succession natural disasters that compounded the political instability of the age. The mandate of heaven, that ancient concept tying divine favor to just rule, was questioned by many. Was the dim sun itself a sign that heaven had turned away? In village shrines, offerings multiplied, prayers became more desperate, and folk rituals meant to call back the light became common. Among the Maya, whose astronomers had long charted the heavens with extraordinary precision, the altered skies presented both a mystery and a warning. Glyphs on stelae record unusual celestial events, and some scholars believe these may correspond to volcanic ash veils or the faint sun of the mid-6th century. The great cities of the Maya lowlands Tikal, Calakmul, Karakol carried on, but the stress on agricultural systems was real, and in some places, ceremonial architecture slowed or stopped altogether. Polynesian navigators, whose lives depended on reading the sky and sea, adjusted their voyages to account for shifts in prevailing winds and currents. Some islands saw more visitors. Others, once regularly connected, became isolated. It was in these subtle changes in trade, in migration, in agriculture that the legacy of 536 lived on, for the crisis was never truly over. Its scars were not measured in years but in altered patterns of life that endured for centuries. People adapted because they had to. The rituals of daily survival became second nature, planting fast, growing crops, preserving food with new techniques, forming tighter kinship networks for mutual aid. And yet, the shadow of the past remained. In every story told by the hearth, in every proverb about caution and preparation, the memory of the long darkness lingered, passed down to those who had not lived it. It was a warning as much as it was history that the world could change without warning, that the sky could dim, and that survival would depend not on strength alone, but on the ability to change with it. By the late 540s and early 550s, a strange paradox defined life across much of the known world. The most immediate darkness had lifted, yet the consequences still rippled outward like the aftershocks of a massive quake. In cities, the memory of the dim sun became a kind of collective scar. People spoke of it with the same hushed tone they might use for a great war or plague. In rural areas, the land itself still bore the marks of that lost decade. Forest edges had crept into abandoned farmland. Wild game had changed their migration routes, and certain plants once staples of the diet had become rarities. Farmers who returned to neglected fields found themselves battling thickets and roots that had gone unchecked for years. Some villages never reformed, their people absorbed into nearby settlements, their old names surviving only in local folklore. Economies that had once been tightly interwoven had loosened, forcing people to become more self-reliant. A merchant in Alexandria could no longer expect the same variety of spices or silks. A blacksmith in Gaul might go years without seeing imported tin. Even so, there was movement toward renewal. Roads were repaired, harbors dredged, and great building projects slowly resumed, though they bore the marks of austerity, fewer adornments, plainer stonework, more focus on function than display. But just as optimism began to spread, another shadow crept across the Mediterranean world. In 541, the so-called Plague of Justinian struck a pandemic that would, in waves, claim millions of lives over the next 2 centuries. For those who had endured 536, it felt like the gods were not finished testing humanity. In Constantinople, the sound of funeral bells became constant. The same ships that carried grain and goods also carried fleas and disease, turning ports into gateways of death. The emperor himself fell ill but survived. Many of his subjects were not so fortunate. Across the Levant, in Egypt, in Italy, the rhythm of life faltered again. This time not because of a dimmed sun, but because of empty streets, shuttered markets, and the silence of whole neighborhoods where no one remained alive to speak. The psychological toll was immense. People began to speak not just of natural disasters, but of a cursed century, a time in which the world was unraveling. Religious leaders in different lands offered competing explanations. Some saw divine punishment for sin, others the work of malevolent spirits, still others a test of faith. In the Norse world, skalds incorporated the twin catastrophes into their oral epics, weaving them into the fabric of Ragnarok itself, a sign that the end might not be a single event but a series of trials, each more severe than the last. And yet, even amid despair, human adaptability showed itself again. In the highlands of Ethiopia, farmers experimented with different planting cycles and crops that could withstand unpredictable weather. In the British Isles, monastic scribes continued their quiet work, copying manuscripts, preserving knowledge that might otherwise have been lost entirely. In Persia, the rebuilding of irrigation systems became a central imperial priority, not only for survival but as a statement that life could and would go on. Across Asia, in regions less touched by the plague but still altered by the climate shifts, kingdoms reasserted themselves with new vigor, as if to fill the vacuum left by the weakened empires to the west. By the mid-550s, the worst of the disasters, both the darkened skies and the first waves of plague, had passed, but the world that emerged was not the same as the one that had gone in. Borders had shifted, economies had realigned, and people had learned to expect uncertainty as part of life itself. The lesson of 536 was etched into memory. The world's stability was fragile, and the sun, the seasons, and even the breath of one's neighbors could all turn against you without warning. It was a century defined not by a single calamity, but by an unbroken chain of them, a reminder that survival is never guaranteed, and that history's most defining moments often arrive not in the form of a single great event, but as a relentless succession of trials that reshape everything they touch. By the time the year 536 had reached its midpoint, the world was already struggling under a weight it could not understand. The sun still shone, but its light was dim, a muted silver that seemed filtered through smoke. Crops, which in a normal year would have been green and heavy by summer, stood weak and stunted, their leaves brittle and pale. Farmers whispered to one another about omens, about God's displeasure, about the end. In monasteries, chroniclers recorded unusual visions, figures with covered faces, signals that no one truly heard yet everyone felt, and a sky that stayed unchanged even when the seasons demanded otherwise. The summer of that year was no true summer at all. Across much of Europe and Asia, temperatures dropped suddenly, as though an unseen force had drawn the warmth from the earth. In Constantinople, the greatest city of its time, markets opened later in the morning because the chill kept people indoors. In China, record keepers noted the strange cold and the way frost clung to fields long past its usual season. In Ireland, the annals spoke with stark brevity, a failure of bread from the years 536 to 539. But in truth, it was more than a failed harvest, it was the slow unwinding of a fragile balance. With no stored reserves, small villages faltered first. Families sent their strongest members away in search of food, and many never came back. In Scandinavia, stories were already forming tales of a great winter before the end of days. It was not only the cold and dim light that unsettled people. The air carried a strange stillness, muffling sound, as though the world itself was holding its breath. Ships at sea reported haze so dense that navigation became nearly impossible, and some captains claimed their instruments behaved unpredictably in the thickest fog. Others spoke of an odd dryness and metallic taste in the air, as though breathing itself was drawing in something unfamiliar. There were no scientific explanations as we know them today. People spoke of divine judgment, hidden magic, or signs of approaching conflict. Leaders urged fasting and public acts of devotion, hoping to ease the unseen burden. In the far north and east, where news moved slowly but superstition moved fast, the response could be severe. Outsiders, travelers, healers, even entire wandering groups were blamed for the skies dimming. Some records tell of grim actions taken in the belief that removing the cause might restore the sun. In modern understanding, evidence points to a massive volcanic eruption, perhaps in Iceland or Central America, that filled the atmosphere with ash and sulfur, scattering sunlight and cooling the planet for years. But in 536, such knowledge was beyond reach. For those living it, it was a mystery so complete it defied all imagination. Nights grew longer in feeling, if not in hours, as though each evening was a deeper descent into a darkness from which morning might never return. In many towns, fires burned through the night, less for warmth than for reassurance. Families gathered in single rooms, whispering quiet hopes before sleep, unsure whether they would wake to another day of dim twilight or to something worse. And while a few cities managed to endure through rationing and stored supplies, countless smaller settlements disappeared from history after that year, their names lost to hunger, illness, and the slow advance of despair. As the year dragged on, the absence of sunlight reshaped life in both obvious and subtle ways. In urban markets, once alive with color and warmth, stalls now stood under a dull glow, their goods lit by flickering oil lamps. Merchants spoke in lowered tones, as though loud voices might somehow challenge whatever held the sky. Farmers, facing crops that would not ripen, began to abandon their fields. In the countryside of Gaul, vineyards were left untended, grapes shriveled and bitter. In the British Isles, barley failed so completely that beer, a daily drink, became rare, kept only for the wealthy or sacred rituals. With bread scarce and beer nearly gone, the familiar patterns of life changed. Seasonal feasts gave way to quiet gatherings, where thin porridge was shared in silence. The hunger was more than physical, it was a longing for the certainty of seasons, for the reassurance that the sun would behave as it always had. Without it, even those with food felt a deep unease. Chroniclers in the Eastern Roman Empire described a kind of sorrow spreading among the people, where otherwise healthy men and women stopped working, sat staring at the dim sky, and spoke of shapes in the clouds. In remote monasteries, monks continued to record each change in the weather, each strange dream, each sign in the heavens, piecing together a chronicle of a year that would echo in memory for generations. Recorded dreams of cities swallowed by shadow, of oceans turned to black glass, and of angels carrying burning censers across the heavens. While such visions could be dismissed as the product of fear and fasting, they were shared too widely to ignore. Trade routes faltered under the strain. Caravans from the east brought fewer goods, not because of war, but because the lands they crossed were barren. Salt, silk, and spices became luxuries beyond the reach of all but kings. In the north, where the cold was most severe, famine pushed entire communities to migrate southward, crowding into cities already straining under their own shortages. This influx of desperate strangers brought tension and violence. In Constantinople, riots broke out when locals accused newcomers of stealing bread from public granaries. In the Frankish kingdoms, traveling families were often turned away from villages at spear point, left to wander the roads until starvation claimed them. Yet amid the darkness, there were moments of resilience. Some communities adapted, planting root vegetables that could grow in cooler, dimmer conditions. Others learned to smoke and preserve fish in greater quantities, building food stores that might see them through another year. Religious leaders, sensing the fragility of hope, organized processions not just for penance, but for solidarity, encouraging people to walk together beneath the strange sky, to sing hymns loudly enough to remind themselves they were still alive. Still, the sense of a world in decline was inescapable. Even the seas were not spared. Fishermen reported strange patterns in the tides, and in some regions, fish populations seemed to vanish overnight. Sailors who once ventured far from shore now hugged the coasts, unwilling to risk being lost in a fog that could swallow entire fleets. And all the while, the volcanic ash high above continued its slow, invisible drift, a shroud that not even the strongest wind seemed able to tear apart. In a time when no one knew the cause and no one could predict an end, the people of 536 lived each day with the quiet dread that this was not a passing trial, but the beginning of an entirely new and more hostile world. By the time the second year of darkness threatened to arrive, the lessons of 536 had already carved themselves into the bones of society. Communities no longer waited for the return of normal skies. They planned as though the dim light would last forever. In the highlands of Armenia, farmers built covered terraces to protect seedlings from the chill, attempting to trap what little warmth the sun offered. In the valleys of Italy, old Roman grain stores were repaired and fortified, guarded by men who once worked the fields but now served as protectors of dwindling resources. Yet even with these measures, hunger was a constant companion. Chroniclers tell of markets where a single loaf of bread was worth a week's wages, and where mothers offered family heirlooms in exchange for a handful of barley. The famine spared no class. Nobles who had once feasted in brightly lit halls now dined on the same watery soups as their servants, the difference between them reduced to the richness of the bowls from which they ate. The church, too, was transformed. In both the East and West, priests and monks abandoned theological disputes to focus on survival, their sermons infused with a sense of urgency. Cathedrals that had once resounded with debates about the nature of Christ now echoed with prayers for light and warmth. Pilgrimages took on a new meaning, not journeys to sacred relics for the sake of devotion, but long, dangerous treks to monasteries rumored to still have food stores. Some pilgrims never returned, their absence a silent testimony to the dangers of the road. The collapse of agriculture and trade reshaped politics as well. Kings who failed to provide for their people found their legitimacy questioned. In the kingdoms of the north, warriors who once fought for their lords began to desert, seeking instead the security of larger, more organized communities. This redistribution of power created strange alliances, rival clans uniting for the sake of survival, and city-states forming pacts with distant neighbors to share resources and manpower. But such unity was fragile. Distrust simmered just below the surface, ready to flare into violence at the first sign of scarcity. Environmental changes continued to feed this tension. Rivers that had once flowed reliably became unpredictable, swollen with sudden floods or shrunken to trickles that barely quenched the thirst of livestock. Coastal towns faced strange storms that arrived without warning, driving fishing boats onto the rocks. Mariners began to speak of a cursed horizon, a line where the sea met the shadowed sky, beyond which no ship should sail. In this climate of uncertainty, superstition thrived. The darkness was interpreted through countless lenses. Some saw it as divine punishment, others as a test of faith, and still others as the work of sorcery or demons. Accusations of witchcraft increased, with outsiders and the poor often bearing the brunt of the fear. Entire families could be driven from villages under suspicion of having called the shadow upon the land. And yet, even in this grim world, life insisted on continuing. Children were still born, their first cries of fragile defiance against the silence of the fields. Weddings still took place, though with meager celebrations and vows spoken under leaden skies. The dead were still buried, their graves marked by stones that cast long, cold shadows in the dim light. The people of 536 learned to carry both hope and despair in equal measure, for neither could be trusted to last. They rose each morning not expecting change, but ready to endure another day of the same. And in that endurance, they forged a kind of strength that would be remembered for centuries, a testament to the resilience of those who lived through what many would call the most difficult years in recorded history. In the wake of the year 536, the world did not simply recover with the change of seasons. The shadow that had been cast over the earth lingered, not just as a literal dimming of the sun, but as a psychological wound etched into the memory of entire generations. By the fifth year after the initial darkness, communities across Europe, the Middle East, and Asia were living in a transformed reality. Crops that once followed the rhythm of the seasons now struggled to germinate at all. Farmers worked fields that yielded a fraction of their former bounty, and what little did grow was often stunted, pale, and tasteless, lacking the nutrients that bodies so desperately needed. Malnutrition became the unspoken constant of daily life. Children grew more slowly. Many never reached adulthood. The elderly, who might once have been the keepers of oral history and tradition, succumbed quickly to illness and starvation. In the towns and cities that had managed to cling to some semblance of normal trade, the marketplaces looked alien. Instead of stalls piled high with bread, meat, and produce, the few merchants who remained might offer dried roots, strips of cured animal hide boiled to make broth, or fermented grains that had been stored years earlier and were now desperately rationed. Even salt, that most basic preservative, became scarce and therefore valuable beyond measure. Entire economies shifted towards survival barter. A pair of sturdy boots might be worth more than a bag of grain, and a single jar of honey could be traded for a small tool or weapon. Social structures, already strained by years of deprivation, began to fracture. The bonds between villages, cities, and kingdoms weakened as rulers struggled to maintain control over populations that were increasingly restless, desperate, and suspicious. In some regions, local warlords emerged, offering protection and access to guarded food stores in exchange for service, loyalty, and sometimes outright fealty. These new power structures were rarely benevolent. They thrived on fear and scarcity, and their rise often meant that the thin line between law and lawlessness dissolved entirely. The psychological toll of the ongoing hardship was as devastating as the physical one. People whispered about divine punishment, about the wrath of gods old and new. Priests and monks spoke of the need for repentance, calling for fasting, even in times when fasting was indistinguishable from starvation, and leading processions through the streets, carrying relics and chanting prayers to beg for the return of the light. Others sought explanations in the sky, believing that the strange dimness of the sun and the bitter cold were signs of cosmic imbalance or omens of the world's end. In such an environment, superstition flourished. Accusations of witchcraft, sorcery, and treachery grew common. Those who seemed unaffected, perhaps due to stored provisions or better shelter, were viewed with suspicion, sometimes dragged before makeshift courts or mob justice. Entire families could be driven from their homes on a whisper of wrongdoing, forced to wander and beg for scraps in lands where no one had anything to spare. Yet amid this chaos, there were also pockets of resilience. Communities that could organize themselves, sharing resources, rotating labor, and protecting each other, sometimes managed to survive in relative stability. In remote monasteries, monks kept meticulous records of the strange weather and the social upheaval it caused, copying manuscripts by candlelight in cold stone halls, perhaps unaware that their work would one day be among the only surviving accounts of these years. Along riverbanks, where fishing could still provide protein, villages learned to smoke and preserve fish in large communal fires, a skill that became a lifeline. In certain mountainous areas, shepherds drove their flocks into sheltered valleys, allowing goats and sheep to graze on the hardiest of shrubs, and thereby maintaining a trickle of dairy products for trade and survival. But even these successes were fragile. A single bad season, a single outbreak of disease, could erase years of effort. And disease was always near. Malnutrition weakened immune systems, making even minor infections deadly. When the first waves of plague arrived, carried by traders or armies moving between desperate lands, they spread like wildfire. In some towns, half the population could vanish in a matter of weeks. Burial grounds filled to overflowing, and the living sometimes had no choice but to pile the dead into mass graves or leave them in the open, where carrion birds became a constant, circling presence in the gray skies. The sound of their wings and their harsh cries became part of the daily soundscape, as common as the wind or the creak of empty carts. What made these years particularly cruel was that the world's knowledge of medicine, agriculture, and weather offered no explanation that could truly make sense of the disaster. People lived in a haze of not knowing if the sun would ever return to its full strength, not knowing if the next year's harvest would feed them or starve them, not knowing whether the stranger approaching down the road was friend, foe, or plague carrier. This uncertainty seeped into every aspect of life, reshaping art, religion, politics, and even the way people spoke to one another. Conversations became shorter, more pragmatic, stripped of pleasantries in favor of essential questions. Do you have food? Do you have news? Is the road safe? Over time, a grim sort of normalcy took root. Generations born after 536 knew no other world than this one of dim skies and scarce resources. Their bodies and minds adapted in ways that might have seemed unthinkable to those who remembered the abundance of earlier decades. Yet, somewhere deep inside, the memory of a brighter world lingered, carried by the old stories and by the very fact that humanity, despite everything, had not yet given up. In the years to come, this persistence would become a defining trait, the ember of endurance that, even in the coldest and darkest of times, refused to die. By the middle decades following the calamity of 536, the world had learned to live in a state of diminished expectation. The idea of a good year no longer meant abundance. It meant survival with just enough grain to avoid famine, just enough livestock to replace those lost to disease, and just enough strength to work the land for another season. The sun still shone dimly, compared to the memories of elders, its pale light casting long, cold shadows across fields that once yielded wheat so tall and golden, it swayed like waves on a summer sea. Now, barley and rye, hardier, less noble grains were the staples, ground into coarse bread that filled the stomach, but left the body craving nutrients. In the marketplaces that had once been centers of color, scent, and sound, the air was quieter, more tense. Traders still came, their carts drawn by weary oxen or half-starved mules, but they brought different wares than before. Silks and perfumes, once valued by the wealthy, had given way to sacks of dried beans, bundles of firewood, and rough cloth woven from whatever fibers could be gathered. Transactions were less about coin and more about barter, a basket of turnips for a repaired wagon wheel, a few strips of salted meat for a warm cloak. Money still existed, but its use was overshadowed by the simple urgency of acquiring what could keep one alive through another winter. In cities, the architecture itself began to change. Ornate stone facades were left to crumble, their carvings worn away not just by time, but by neglect. People scavenged abandoned buildings for usable timber, metal fittings, and even stones, which they carried to reinforce their own homes against the cold. Fires were constant, not in the destructive sense, but as a necessity. The lingering chill of the climate meant that hearths burned year-round, consuming wood at a rate that stripped nearby forests and left distant hillsides bare. In places where wood grew scarce, people burned dried animal dung, peat, or even twisted bundles of reeds soaked in oil, filling the air with a pungent haze that clung to skin and hair. Social customs adapted to these new realities. Hospitality, once a celebrated virtue, became a calculated risk. Strangers at the gate were met with caution, sometimes armed confrontation. Yet, paradoxically, in tightly knit communities, cooperation grew stronger. Families pooled their food stores, neighbors helped repair each other's roofs, and children were raised collectively, their care a shared responsibility in the face of constant threat. Religion continued to shape the way people understood their plight. In Christian Europe, sermons often framed the events of 536 and its aftermath as a divine test, urging the faithful to persevere in humility and penance. In the Byzantine Empire, liturgical processions for rain, warmth, or deliverance from famine became almost routine, winding through streets with incense smoke trailing behind. In the far reaches of the Middle East and Central Asia, scholars and mystics debated the cosmic significance of the strange climate, blending astronomical observation with prophecy. Some spoke of a veil drawn across the heavens, a punishment or a warning that would only be lifted when humanity learned its lesson. Such interpretations gave meaning to suffering but also deepened the weight of guilt many carried. In the far north, where winters had always been harsh, adaptation was more seamless, though still brutal. Scandinavian settlements relied heavily on fishing, hunting, and preserved goods. They stored dried cod, smoked reindeer meat, and fermented vegetables in underground pits, protected from the worst of the cold. Seafaring journeys, dangerous at the best of times, became even riskier as weather patterns grew unpredictable, yet they continued driven by the need to trade, raid, or explore in search of more favorable lands. In the East, in the vast landscapes of China, court records and local chronicles speak of crop failures and the spread of famine across multiple provinces. The imperial government, already strained, attempted relief measures, distributing stored grain, reducing taxes, and relocating entire villages to more fertile areas. But moving people en masse was as dangerous as leaving them to starve. For such migrations spread disease as readily as they offered hope, and disease was never far. The climate disruptions of the 6th century coincided with the early outbreaks of what would become the plague of Justinian. Rats infested grain stores, fleas carried the invisible killer from one settlement to another, and ships became unwitting vessels of contagion. Those who survived the fever and swelling often found themselves alone in emptied neighborhoods, haunted by the silence of streets where children once played and merchants once haggled. The cultural memory of these years began to crystallize in stories, songs, and moral lessons. Folktales spoke of the year without a summer, though in truth it was many years. Songs described a sun that hid in shame, a moon that wept frost, and a world where the seasons had lost their names. These narratives were not simply entertainment. They were tools of remembrance, warnings for future generations that the earth could betray them, or perhaps that they could betray the earth. Yet, even in the bleakest periods, human ingenuity persisted. Farmers experimented with crop rotation and intercropping, planting beans among grains to replenish the soil. Herds were moved to new grazing lands in carefully timed circuits to avoid exhausting the vegetation. In coastal regions, salt production by evaporation continued, allowing fish and meat to be preserved for months at a time. Such strategies did not erase the hardship, but they carved out spaces of survival and, occasionally, small pockets of comfort. Comfort, in this context, might mean a hot meal shared in a warm room, or the return of a relative from a dangerous journey. It might mean the first sight of green shoots in spring, fragile but alive, hinting at the possibility of renewal. People learned to measure happiness in these smaller terms, finding value in things once overlooked. As the 6th century moved toward its later decades, the skies began to clear fractionally, and harvests improved in certain regions. Yet the trauma of the long dimming had left its mark. It was etched into the lines of faces, into the cautious way people spoke about the future, into the guardedness with which they approached any sign of prosperity. Even as the earth warmed and the sun shone more strongly, no one forgot how quickly it could be taken away. And that fear, as much as the hunger, the cold, and the loss, was what truly bound the survivors of 536 to one another across cultures, faiths, and continents. They were a generation shaped not just by catastrophe, but by the knowledge that the world could change without warning, and that survival depended not on certainty, but on resilience. By the time the worst of the shadowed years began to fade, those who had endured them were no longer the same people they had been before. Even in regions where the climate seemed to recover, the rhythms of life had shifted permanently. The survivors carried themselves differently, slower, more deliberate, as though every action was weighed against the possibility of another sudden catastrophe. In villages, Children who had grown up never knowing a bright summer now looked with suspicion at the returning sunlight, as if it might burn too hot or disappear again without warning. The old men told them stories not to frighten them, but to remind them that the world was not fixed, that the land and sky were as changeable as the moods of the gods or the tempers of kings. These stories took root in the culture, woven into oral traditions, shaping the way future generations thought about prosperity, famine, and fate. In markets, the abundance that slowly returned was met with both joy and mistrust. Traders laid out baskets of figs, bolts of dyed cloth, jars of honey, and freshly caught fish. But buyers hesitated before spending their coins, remembering the years when such luxuries vanished overnight. The practice of storing surplus in hidden caches became almost universal. Families buried ceramic jars filled with grain, dried meat, or even water, sealing them against moisture and rot, marking the spot in ways only they would recognize: a bent tree, a carved stone, a pattern of stakes in the earth. These secret reserves were not shared lightly, for while trust within communities was deep, it had been forged under conditions where scarcity made even the closest friends hesitate before giving away too much. Religious life adapted as well. In some places, the calamity had deepened faith, reinforcing the belief that divine favor was the only shield against nature's wrath. Pilgrimages to sacred sites multiplied, with worshippers bringing offerings, candles, carvings, coins, in the hope of securing protection for their families. In other places, however, faith had been tested to the breaking point. There were whispers of priests abandoning their posts, of temples left empty, of holy men retreating to solitude in the mountains or forests to seek answers away from the noise of human suffering. Among the wealthier classes, the return of trade routes brought new opportunities and new risks. Ships once again sailed the Mediterranean, laden with spices from the east, glassware from Egypt, furs from the north. Caravans crossed deserts carrying ivory, silk, and lapis lazuli. Yet travel remained dangerous. Roads still bore the scars of neglect. Bridges had collapsed. Way stations had crumbled. Banditry flourished in the gaps between well-patrolled regions, and storms at sea could erase months of profit in a single night. For rulers and their courts, the challenge was political as well as material. Empires had been weakened during the long years of scarcity, their borders tested by opportunistic rivals. Fortresses were repaired, militias reformed, and alliances renegotiated. Yet even as kings and emperors sought to project strength, they faced the quiet resistance of populations that had learned to live without relying entirely on central authority. Local leaders, village councils, and even extended families had become the real centers of decision-making during the crisis, and they were not eager to surrender that autonomy. In rural landscapes, the scars of the famine remained visible. Fields that had once been meticulously cultivated still lay fallow, dotted with the skeletal remains of trees stripped for firewood. Some settlements had been abandoned entirely, their walls collapsing inward, their wells dry or fouled. In these ghost villages, nature reclaimed what humans had left behind: ivy climbing over doorways, moss covering stone paths, wild animals roaming freely where children once played. Travelers sometimes camped in these ruins, but never comfortably. There was a sense that the air still carried the memory of suffering, that the stones themselves remembered. Among artisans, the disaster had left its own mark. Potters produced more practical vessels than ornate ones, focusing on durability over beauty. Weavers favored thicker, coarser fabrics to provide warmth. Blacksmiths turned their skill toward tools and agricultural implements rather than decorative armor. Art, where it persisted, often reflected the somber mood of the age: darker pigments, starker imagery, scenes of endurance rather than triumph. And yet, in some unexpected ways, the hardships of 536 had sown seeds for future growth. The forced diversification of crops had strengthened agricultural resilience. The emphasis on local trade had encouraged self-sufficiency. The necessity of cooperation had forged bonds that would, in some places, outlast the memory of the crisis itself. In certain regions, storytellers began to frame the dark years not only as a time of loss, but as a crucible from which a stronger, wiser people had emerged. They spoke of ancestors who had survived on little, who had kept the flame of knowledge alive when the world seemed to be ending. These narratives, while not erasing the suffering, offered a measure of pride, a counterweight to the grief. But perhaps the most enduring legacy was the change in the way people thought about time. Before the year 536, time had been measured in predictable cycles: planting, harvest, festivals, markets, each year much like the one before. Afterward, time felt less certain, more fragile. The idea that the world could alter so suddenly, that the sun could dim and the air grow cold for reasons no one could fully explain, lodged itself deep in the human imagination. It bred a caution that would echo for generations, a readiness to expect the unexpected. And so, as life slowly resumed its patterns, there was always an undercurrent of watchfulness. Eyes lifted to the sky not only to read the weather, but to search for any sign of another veil descending over the earth. Farmers planted their seeds with hope, but also with contingency plans. Merchants rebuilt their networks, but kept reserves hidden. Rulers celebrated their renewed power, but remembered how quickly authority could falter when faced with forces beyond human control. The world had survived the worst year in recorded history, but survival had come with a lesson that no one dared to forget: that civilization was never more than a few seasons away from unraveling, and that the true measure of strength was not in abundance, but in the ability to endure when abundance failed. In the decades following the Great Dimming, the memory of 536 did not simply fade into history books. It became a living presence, a silent witness that shaped decisions, both great and small. Parents told their children the story not as distant history, but as something they had lived through, a warning disguised as a bedtime tale. They described the endless gray skies, the crops withering before they could bear fruit, the sound of hungry villages gone quiet when even hope seemed too costly to spend. These retellings were not meant to terrify, but they carried an unspoken command: never be unprepared, never trust that the earth will always be generous. In towns where trade had returned, there was a new caution in how people celebrated prosperity. Feasts were fewer, more measured. When a good harvest came, only part of it was brought to market. The rest was stored away in granaries reinforced with stone, lined against damp with ash or woven reeds. Even wedding dowries began to change. Where once they might have been heavy with jewelry or silks, they now often included sacks of grain, bundles of dried herbs, tools, or animals, symbols not of beauty, but of survival. Religion, too, bore the mark of those shadow years. Across Europe, the Middle East, and Asia, new rituals emerged, many of them shaped by the trauma of famine and plague. In some churches, special days of prayer were held to keep the sun in the sky, even when centuries later the cause of the darkness was still debated. In Buddhist temples of the East, monks chanted sutras that spoke of impermanence and the fragility of all things, while, in the Islamic world, poets wove verses about the fleeting nature of human plans in the face of divine will. Yet not all the religious responses were solemn. In some remote villages, annual festivals were created to mock the darkness, with bonfires, torches, and lanterns burning all night, as if to defy the memory of those dim days. Politically, the world's powers still trembled from the aftershocks. The Eastern Roman Empire, already battered by war and the plague that followed, struggled to hold its borders. Persia faced similar strain. Its satrapies, growing restless under heavy taxation, meant to rebuild lost wealth. In the north, emerging kingdoms saw opportunity in the weakness of old empires, and raiding became more frequent not only for gold or land, but for grain, livestock, and skilled laborers. Leaders who remembered 536 were often harsher in enforcing law, knowing how quickly desperation could breed rebellion. The landscape itself continued to remind people of the disaster. Forests that had regrown over abandoned fa, Farmland gave the countryside a wilder, more untamed appearance. Rivers had changed course during years of flooding, swallowing entire fields and making maps obsolete. In coastal areas, fishing villages thrived where agriculture had once dominated, the sea becoming a more dependable provider than the earth. In the mountains, communities learned to cultivate hardy crops like barley and rye, or to keep goats and sheep instead of cattle. The arts, too, reflected the shadow years. Epic poems spoke of a time when the day was night, and painters used deep, muted tones to depict scenes of endurance, lone figures against vast, empty landscapes, or families huddled around the meager glow of a fire. Some artists chose to look forward, crafting intricate designs that celebrated renewal. Vines curling around old stone ruins, the sun breaking through dark clouds, rivers overflowing with life. Even so, the creative spirit often carried an undercurrent of caution, as if beauty itself might vanish if too loudly celebrated. In Science and Learning, 536 and its aftermath encouraged the slow but steady collection of knowledge about the natural world. Farmers began to keep written records of seasonal patterns, rainfall, and crop yields, passing these observations to the next generation. Healers experimented with hardier medicinal plants that could thrive in poor conditions. In some monasteries, scholars debated the cause of the darkness, whether it had been the judgment of God, the shadow of a great celestial event, or some natural disaster beyond human control. These debates did not always reach conclusions, but they planted the seeds for later generations to ask more questions about the forces that could shape and endanger human life. Yet perhaps the greatest change was in the way people thought about each other. In the years of famine, trust had been both vital and fragile. Villages that had pulled together had survived better than those divided by greed or suspicion. This lesson, repeated in countless family stories, became a moral cornerstone in many places, that survival depended not only on strength, but on cooperation. And so in marketplaces, in taverns, at the edge of fields, people talked and traded not just goods, but news and warnings, building a network of shared awareness that stretched beyond the boundaries of any single settlement. Still, the shadow of 536 lingered in the human heart. On mornings when fog clung to the ground and the sun rose dim through a pale sky, elders would fall silent, eyes fixed on the horizon. Children, sensing the shift, would ask no questions. And when the fog lifted, when the light returned, a quiet relief would pass through the community, not just for the day's work ahead, but for the reassurance that the darkness had not come back. In the century that followed, the world seemed to grow more cautious, as though it had learned that stability was a fragile illusion. Even as crops returned and trade routes revived, there was a quiet awareness that the darkness could come again unannounced, uninvited, unstoppable. This awareness shaped the rhythm of daily life. Farmers, though they tilled the soil with renewed vigor, did so with a kind of reverence, treating each seed as if it might be the last to sprout. Scribes began to record not only taxes and trade, but the subtler patterns of the seasons, the dates of first frosts, the arrival of migratory birds, the flowering of certain trees. In this way, they built a calendar of memory, a ledger of nature itself. In port cities, sailors told tales of distant lands where the darkness had been worse, where the sea had turned a strange, sickly color and dead fish washed ashore for weeks. Whether these stories were true or the product of fearful imagination, they spread quickly, becoming part of a shared global lore. Such accounts only deepened the belief that the world's balance could be tipped without warning. In architecture, communities began to build with resilience in mind. In places where famine had once emptied whole neighborhoods, stone granaries now stood at the center of towns, fortified as if they were as valuable as castles. Wells were dug deeper, lined with stone to prevent collapse, and cisterns were built to store water for lean years. Even homes reflected this new practicality. Cellars grew larger, insulated with earth to keep stored food safe from heat and cold. In colder regions, Families began adding small smoke vents to their roofs, allowing them to dry herbs, grains, and even meat inside without letting in the winter air. The culture of trade shifted as well. Where once luxury goods had been prized above all, now merchants carried staples alongside silks and spices. Salt, once a humble necessity, became as sought after as jewels, for it could preserve food through long winters or unexpected shortages. Honey, too, rose in value, not just as a sweetener, but as a preservative and medicine. In some cities, the right to stock, or sell certain foods became a matter of political control, with guilds and local lords guarding these privileges closely. Among the people, a subtle change in temperament emerged. They became simultaneously more resourceful and more superstitious. In villages, old charms against famine and disease were revived, from small bundles of herbs hung over doorways to whispered blessings said over the first loaf of bread from a new harvest. Children learn these rituals as naturally as they learn their letters, passing them down without question. Yet, alongside this mysticism came a growing body of practical knowledge. Farmers experimented with crop rotation, planting legumes to restore soil, and fishermen learned to track seasonal fish migrations with greater precision. In the East, irrigation systems became more sophisticated, designed to capture every drop of seasonal rain. Even the arts bore the stamp of 536. In tapestries, you could see the contrast between shadow and light, between withered fields and green renewal. Storytellers traveled from village to village, weaving parables of endurance and warning. One common tale told of a traveler who, finding a village celebrating a great harvest, warned them not to eat too much too quickly. The villagers laughed at him, but the next year famine came, and only those who had heeded his advice survived. This story and others like it became moral compasses, reminders that joy should be tempered with foresight. Politically, the lessons of 536 reshaped diplomacy. Alliances were formed not only for defense against human enemies, but for mutual aid in times of scarcity. Kings and chiefs exchanged not just gold or marriage alliances, but grain, livestock, and skilled workers. Some of these alliances lasted for generations, maintained by shared memories of how fragile life could be. Yet even in this new world of caution, there were those who sought to exploit fear. Traveling prophets and self-proclaimed visionaries claimed they could prevent the darkness from returning for a price. Some demanded coin, others land or influence. In desperate times, people listened, and though most of these promises proved empty, the fact that such figures could gain followers at all was proof that the memory of 536 remained sharp. The skies themselves seemed to conspire in keeping that memory alive. Every eclipse was met with apprehension. Every season of heavy volcanic haze, even from distant eruptions, was cause for whispered prayers. People would gather in open spaces, staring upward in silence until the sun shone clearly again, only dispersing when someone finally laughed or clapped, breaking the tension. Over time, new generations grew who had not lived through 536, but had inherited its shadow through stories. For them, it was almost a myth, a cautionary epic. Yet in the eyes of their grandparents, the fear was not abstract, it was a scar, always ready to ache when clouds gathered too thickly. In this way, the year 536 never truly ended. It lived on in cellars stocked for winter, in stone granaries at the heart of towns, in songs sung softly by firelight. It was not just history, it was a lesson, etched into the very habits of humanity, reminding them that the world could change in a breath, and that only those who planned for the unthinkable would endure. Centuries after the ash clouds had thinned, and the sun had burned once more without that cold, uncanny halo, the year 536 was still spoken of as if it had happened yesterday. In monasteries across Europe, scribes copied not only the scriptures, but also annals detailing the events: the year of the sun's dimming, the year the crops failed, the year when entire villages simply vanished. These records were treated with a mixture of reverence and dread, as if writing them down was both a duty and a ward against forgetting. In Asia, scholars debated whether it had been a celestial omen, a punishment from heaven, or the result of distant volcanoes whose names had been lost to time. Some thought the answer mattered less than the lesson, that humanity was small in the face of forces it could neither control nor fully understand. In Africa, oral traditions preserve the memory in different tones, some as cautionary tales, others as stories of miraculous survival. Among nomadic peoples, the memory became woven into migration patterns, their seasonal movements designed not just for following game or avoiding enemies, but for ensuring they would never again be trapped in a place that could not sustain them through a year without sun. In the Middle East, where merchants and scholars connected continents, the story of 536 became a thread running through every caravan's gossip. The same merchants who traded silks and spices also carried tales of the darkness, retelling it in every marketplace. Over time, the events of that year began to merge, with older myths, flood stories, tales of the long night, legends of gods retreating from the woe of our world. This blending of history and myth meant that the exact details blurred, but the warning remained intact. The world could be undone at any time. The arts of architecture, engineering, and agriculture carried subtle fingerprints of that fear. In northern climates, houses were built with thicker walls and smaller windows, conserving heat against another cold summer. In southern lands, irrigation systems and reservoirs expanded in scale, their builders motivated by the belief that even if the skies failed them again, the earth might still yield water. In coastal towns, fishing fleets grew larger and more organized, with the understanding that the sea could become the primary source of food when fields failed. Religions, too, adapted in the wake of 536. In some faiths, the darkness was interpreted as divine judgment, leading to stricter observances, more public rituals, and new taboos meant to avert future calamity. In others, it was seen as a trial of endurance, proof that humanity could survive even when the gods seemed absent. Pilgrimages to sacred sites increased as people sought to honor powers they believed had spared them. In the quiet of temples and churches, prayers were whispered not for wealth or power, but simply for another year of light. Literature reflected this shift in values. The poetry of the centuries after 536 was often tinged with melancholy, a recognition of life's fragility. Songs celebrated not grand victories in battle, but small acts of kindness during famine years, or the resilience of a single family who endured. In epic tales, heroes were not always warriors. Sometimes they were farmers who shared their seed grain with neighbors, healers who traveled across snowbound landscapes, or sailors who risked dangerous seas to bring food to starving towns. Even the legal codes of some regions bore traces of 536's influence. Laws were written to prevent hoarding during times of scarcity or to ensure that grain reserves were maintained by towns and kingdoms alike. In some places, breaking these laws was treated as harshly as treason, for it was understood that in a year of darkness, betrayal could be measured not in blood spilled, but in bread withheld. Generations grew and passed, but the behaviors forged in that year did not fade. A child in the 10th century might not know the name of the volcano that had shrouded the earth in ash, but they knew to check the cellar every week, to note whether the stores of dried beans, salted fish, and preserved fruit were full. A merchant in the 12th century might not recall the details of the famine chronicles, but he would always carry extra grain alongside his more valuable goods, knowing it could become the most precious cargo of all. Over time, the memory of 536 also became a measure of other disasters. Chroniclers would describe later famines, plagues, or strange weather with the phrase, "It was not as bad as the year without sun," a grim yardstick for suffering. Even when the world seemed peaceful, the shadow of that year lingered in the corner of human thought, a quiet reminder that nature's balance could tip without warning. And yet, within that shadow, there was also a strange kind of strength. The story of 536 was not only one of loss and fear, but of adaptation. Humanity had survived, adapted, and in some ways grown wiser. In the end, perhaps that was the truest legacy of the worst year in history, not that it had nearly broken the world, but that it had not succeeded. By the time the year 536 had passed into the realm of distant history, its shadow was so deeply woven into the fabric of human culture that people no longer needed to be told the details to understand its weight. It had become a shared ghost, invisible, but present, haunting every harvest, every sunrise, every stretch of cloud that dimmed the day. In villages across Europe, old women would squint at the sky when a summer morning seemed too cold and mutter warnings that the year without the sun could come again. The youngest children, listening to these words, would glance upward as if expecting the light to fade in front of their eyes. In the bustling markets of the Middle East, merchants still measured the value of goods against grain, not gold, a silent acknowledgement that when the earth failed, no treasure shone brighter than food. The Far East carried its own remembrance, a mingling of historical record and poetic illusion. Scholars recorded the anomaly in imperial archives, detailing the long twilight and the bitter harvests. But poets turned it into a symbol, the dimming sun as a metaphor for political decay, for the loss of virtue in rulers, for the vulnerability of even the greatest dynasties. In Africa, the oral traditions passed through generations, painted 536, not as a singular event, but as part of a cyclical rhythm. Years of plenty, years of hunger, and the necessity of always preparing for the turn of fortune. This cyclical understanding perhaps offered more peace than fear, for if darkness was inevitable, then so too was its eventual lifting. Yet the deeper, unspoken legacy of 536 was in how it shaped the human imagination. The notion that the world could shift, abruptly and without human cause, lodged itself in the heart of every culture that remembered. Folklore became filled with omens of the sky, a red moon, a ring around the sun, a sudden stillness in the air. These were not idle superstitions. They were fragments of inherited memory, survival tools disguised as myth. Even architecture bore the mark. Cities that rose in the centuries after 536 often had granaries built into their design, as if hunger itself were an enemy that could be walled out. Wells and cisterns multiplied, their presence as important as defensive towers. The concept of storing against disaster became so ingrained that even in good years, leaders would boast of their reserves as much as of their victories. In religious life, 536 had created both division and unity. Some faiths hardened their doctrines, claiming that only absolute obedience could prevent another catastrophe. Others widened their embrace, suggesting that the darkness had been a test of compassion, that survival had been granted to those who shared rather than hoarded. Pilgrimages to high mountains, once seen as spiritual retreats, now carried practical undertones. People climbed not only to touch the heavens, but to scan the horizon, to look for the telltale smudge of ash that might signal the return of the long night. In literature and song, the year's memory lingered in subtle refrains. Ballads of love might include a verse about waiting for the sun's return. Epics of war might compare a defeated army to fields in the year without warmth. Even lullabies meant to soothe sometimes carried a warning tone, a reminder to be brave if the world ever grew dark again. Centuries of retelling ensured that 536 was not just a date in history, but a shape in the collective mind. It was the knowledge that life could change utterly without warning, and that survival was not a given. And yet, this same awareness forged a stubborn kind of hope. The people who lived after 536 did not merely endure. They adapted, innovated, and built systems meant to shield their descendants from the worst. It was as if the darkness had forced humanity to hold a mirror to itself and decide very clearly whether it wished to go on. In this way, the year 536 was not only the worst in human memory, it was also one of the most defining. By the medieval era, the year 536 had become less a piece of recorded history and more a shadowed myth, yet it remained deeply embedded in the worldview of kings, peasants, and priests alike. The chronicles written by monks in candlelit scriptoria spoke of it in hushed tones, placing it alongside biblical floods and the plagues of Egypt, as if it were part of a divine cycle rather than a random act of the earth. The unshakable lesson was that the sky itself could turn against humankind, and this belief was a quiet undercurrent in nearly every medieval fear. In the courts of Europe, rulers funded astrologers as readily as they funded armies, believing that the stars might warn of another darkening. In great stone cathedrals, priests wove 536 into sermons, warning congregations that God's displeasure had once dimmed the sun for more than a year and could do so again should sin grow too bold. And in the farmlands beyond those cathedrals' bells, old women still taught children to note the color of the dawn sky and the taste of the evening wind, for these were said to be omens of famine. The medieval mind saw no sharp line between history and prophecy. What had happened before could and surely would happen again. This constant low hum of dread shaped how cities were built and how kingdoms were governed. The massive stone granaries that dotted the countryside were more than pragmatic storage. They were symbols of preparedness, talismans against the hunger that had nearly erased civilizations in the past. Even in years of abundance, surplus grain was salted, dried, and sealed, not merely for winter, but for the possibility of another year without summer. Across Europe and the Near East, chronicles of more recent volcanic winters, in 1108, in 1258, were interpreted as echoes of the ancient catastrophe, reminders that 536's darkness was not unique, but part of a pattern too vast to stop. In the Islamic world, scholars of the Abbasid Caliphate preserved translations of earlier Byzantine and Persian accounts of the Great Dimming, studying them alongside astronomical treatises. To them, the lesson was not simply one of faith, but of vigilance. The world was governed by cycles both divine and natural, and the wise ruler was one who watched the sky as closely as he watched his borders. In China and Japan, where the memory of the mid-6th century famine had filtered down through dynastic records, imperial courts maintained astronomers whose duties included not only charting celestial events, but interpreting them as warnings. An unexpected halo around the sun, a sudden blood-red moon, these could prompt rituals meant to ward off the fate of 536. Even art bore the mark. Medieval illuminated manuscripts sometimes showed miniature suns surrounded by dark clouds or pale orbs half hidden behind inked swirls. Visual shorthand for a cosmic calamity. These were not decorative flourishes. They were cultural memories preserved in pigment and gold leaf. And in song, the wandering troubadours of Europe sometimes sang of the year the sun slept. Their verses wrapped in metaphor but unmistakable to those who had grown up with the warning. This half-forgotten catastrophe influenced how medieval societies interpreted more familiar disasters. When the Great Famine of 1315 struck, bringing years of rain and crop failure, many in Europe whispered that it was the shadow of 536 returning proof that the sun could turn its face away from humanity once more. Such beliefs did not necessarily breed despair. They encouraged stockpiling, alliances, and the careful recording of strange natural events. But they also fed a deep-seated fatalism, a sense that the world's beauty was fragile and temporary, always at risk of being swallowed by a sudden, cold dark. And so, even as cathedrals rose higher, as trade routes thickened with goods and travelers, as knowledge accumulated in the quiet stacks of monastic libraries, there was always behind the hymns, behind the harvest festivals, behind the laughter in the marketplace, the whisper of a time when the light failed, and the world was forced to live in shadow. By the dawn of the early modern age, the year 536 had faded from most public records, yet its ghost persisted in the margins of history, hidden in footnotes, tucked inside monastic manuscripts, or whispered in the oral traditions of rural communities. The scholars of the Renaissance, digging through the dust of ancient libraries, stumbled upon strange passages in Latin, Greek, and Syriac texts describing a sun that gave no warmth and a world that seemed to shiver for years. They puzzled over the words, unsure whether to treat them as allegory or eyewitness account. In the courts of Europe, where humanist curiosity now mingled with political ambition, such fragments were sometimes read aloud as entertainment, as proof that the ancients had lived through marvels and terrors alike. But beyond the salons and academies, farmers, sailors, and traders carried older, earthier versions of the tale, ones less concerned with literary polish and more with the raw truth of hunger and survival. In Scandinavia, ballads still spoke of the long frost, a time when wolves came down from the hills and men fought over the carcasses of oxen. In the Highlands of Scotland, shepherds told of a winter that stretched across 3 harvests, when the lochs froze solid and even the deer starved. Such stories were not precise history. They were memory shaped by centuries of retelling. Yet, they bore the bones of 536's truth. The early modern period also brought a new kind of fear. Scientific curiosity without the ability to control what it uncovered. Astronomers charted sunspots, comets, and eclipses, wondering whether these could trigger the kind of darkness described in the old texts. In 1645, when a period of unusually low solar activity, the Maunder Minimum, began, some wondered if the year without sun had returned. The 17th and 18th centuries were rich with speculation. Enlightenment thinkers, armed with both reason and an eagerness for catastrophe, debated whether such an event could happen again, whether a volcano, a comet, or some celestial misalignment could throw the world into another long shadow. The memory of 536 was no longer framed as divine punishment, but as a natural disaster, one that no king, priest, or scientist could prevent. By the 19th century, as archaeology matured into a discipline as science, excavations in Europe, Asia, and the Americas began to reveal evidence of abrupt societal shifts in the mid-6th century. Cities abandoned, trade networks disrupted, burial grounds overflowing. Historians connected these findings with the long-forgotten accounts of the sun's dimming, breathing life into a mystery that had slumbered for over 1,000 years. And then, in the 20th century, science finally caught up with the legend. Glaciologists drilling deep into Greenland's ice sheets found volcanic ash trapped in layers corresponding to the year 536. Tree ring studies confirmed stunted growth worldwide, matching the old chronicler's words about failed harvests and bitter cold. The pieces fit. A massive volcanic eruption, perhaps in the tropics, had thrown the world into a haze that lingered for more than a year, altering climate and history alike. Yet even with a scientific explanation, the emotional weight of 536 remains. Modern culture still responds to echoes of it. When volcanic winters occur, as after Tambora's eruption in 1815 or Pinatubo's in 1991 headlines, recall the year without summer, a phrase that owes its origin to that ancient catastrophe. In popular imagination, the idea of the sun vanishing, of days locked in twilight, still holds primal power. It has inspired novels, films, and apocalyptic predictions, not because people fear the exact year 536, but because it speaks to a universal vulnerability. We are still in many ways medieval in our fear of the sky turning against us. Today, climate scientists and historians look back at 536, not just as a historical curiosity, but as a warning. The interconnectedness of our world, far greater now than in the 6th century, means that a similar event could ripple through economies, politics, and societies with unprecedented speed. Satellites and technology might give us advance notice, but they would not stop the ash from falling or the temperatures from dropping. In that sense, 536 has never truly ended. It is a reminder etched in ice, in tree rings, and in our collective imagination, that the line between light and darkness is far thinner than we like to believe. And so the shadow of that year stretches quietly into the present, an ancient memory that, like the dimmed sun itself, refuses to fade.